Imagine, just for a second, that you live in a world where locking your front door is actually considered a little bit weird.
Right, like almost defensive.
Yeah, offensive to your neighbors. You're in this modestly prosperous, super tight-knit Midwestern town at the turn of the 20th century. The street lamps are casting this warm glow, kids are out playing until the sun dips down. And that piece of wood swinging on hinges at the front of your
It's
house?
definitely not a barricade.
No, not at all. It's just there to keep the prairie wind and like stray dogs out.
Well, I mean, it was an entirely different psychological landscape than the one we occupy today.
Totally.
That open door was basically the physical manifestation of a societal contract. It was this unspoken agreement built on absolute implicit trust in the people around you.
Exactly. You don't lock out the world because you fundamentally believe there is just nothing out there to fear. Which is a really comforting way to live, you know?
Absolutely.
But what happens when that illusion of safety isn't just broken, but violently shattered overnight? Today, we are taking a deep dive into the 1912 Villisca Axe Murders.
And just to be clear right up front, this isn't just a recounting of a true crime cold case.
Right.
We are exploring the actual anatomy of community trauma. Because the crime itself, horrific as it is really only the inciting incident.
Yeah, it's just the beginning.
What follows is this textbook study in how human beings react when their reality is fractured.
It's crazy.
We're looking at paranoia, the destruction of evidence through sheer morbid panic, the scapegoating of innocence, and the fascinating way that history eventually mutates into folklore.
So, to put this together for you today, we've been digging through a massive, really diverse stack of source material.
A huge stack.
Yeah, we are talking deep-cut historical records. We
Okay.
have a heavily researched investigative piece from Smithsonian Magazine, and we've been scouring the iAgent web archive.
Which is such a cool resource.
Oh, it's amazing. If you aren't familiar, it's this incredible grassroots project where volunteers digitize decades of old local newspaper clippings. So it gives us a real-time look at the hysteria as it unfolded.
And we're even pulling from an academic paper on architectural preservation.
Right, because as we'll discover, the physical buildings left behind in this town serve as these silent, permanent witnesses to both our darkest nightmares and, our capacity to rebuild.
The structural legacy of an event like this is often the most honest record we have left.
Yeah.
I mean, long after the rumors fade and the eyewitnesses are gone, the bricks and timber just remain.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's go back to that timber.
Right.
We have to start with the stark reality of what happened in the dark because it sets the stage for the century of madness that followed.
It's pretty brutal.
Very. It's the night of June 9th, crossing into the early hours of June 10th, 1912. The town is Villisca, Iowa. Population is roughly 2,000. It's a thriving railroad town. And as we established, nobody locks their doors.
Which is a vulnerability that the perpetrator didn't just stumble upon, right? He clearly relied upon it as a core component of his methodology.
Yeah, he counted on it. So, sometime shortly after midnight, a figure walks up to the two-story home of Josiah B. Moore. Everyone called him Joe and his wife, Sarah. They are a well-liked, successful family.
Pillars of the community, basically.
Exactly. The intruder walks to the back door, lifts the simple latch, and just steps inside. And immediately we see a level of terrifying, methodical preparation.
He doesn't just stumble around in the dark.
No. He locates an oil lamp on a dresser. But he doesn't just light it to see where he's going. He physically dismantles it.
This part always gets me.
Right. He removes the glass chimney and sets it aside on the floor, tucked under a chair. Then he reaches into the lamp and bends the wick in two.
Wow.
Only then does he light it, turning the flame down so low that it produces nothing more than a really faint, localized glimmer.
If we pause and just look at the mechanics of that action, it tells us an enormous amount about who we are dealing with. Let's think about how an oil lamp works.
Okay.
The glass chimney is designed to draw oxygen up, feeding the flame and projecting the light outward to illuminate a whole room.
Right, it acts like a funnel.
Exactly. So by removing that chimney, you starve the flame of that updraft. It becomes weak. And then by physically bending the wick, you reduce the surface area that's actually burning. What he created, essentially, is the 1912 equivalent of tactical night vision.
That's chilling. He's creating a highly controlled microenvironment.
Precisely. He needs just enough illumination to see his own hands and map the floor plan. But he is hyper-aware of light discipline.
Because a normal flame would cast shadows, right?
Yeah, shadows against the window shades that might bleed under a bedroom door and wake someone up. He is managing his environment with a level of terrifying precision that suggests This is not his first time navigating a hostile sleeping house.
And he moves through that house with total confidence. He walks right past a downstairs guest bedroom. Sleeping inside are two young girls, the Stillinger sisters.
Lena and Ina.
Yeah, Lena, who is 12, and Ina, who is 9. They were just over for a sleepover after a church event. He completely ignores them. He creeps up the narrow, creaky wooden stairs to the second floor.
Which is so risky in an old house.
Right. And he bypasses the children's room, where the 4 more kids are sleeping, and heads straight into Joe and Sarah's master bedroom. Now, he's carrying an axe, and it wasn't even his axe.
He found it on the property.
Yeah, he picked up Joe Moore's own axe from the coal shed out in the backyard. He approaches the bed, but when he strikes Joe, he doesn't use the sharp edge of the blade. He turns it around and brings the heavy, flat back of the axe head down, completely crushing Joe's skull. Then he immediately does the same to Sarah.
This is a detail that investigators and profilers focus on heavily because it reveals a really cold, practical intelligence.
How so?
Well, if you strike a human skull with the sharp edge of a heavy, wedge-shaped object like an axe, basic physics dictates that the blade is highly likely to lodge deep in the bone. It gets stuck.
Oh, wow. And if it's stuck, you've just disarmed yourself.
Exactly. You are suddenly wrestling to free your weapon while the victim's spouse wakes up screaming right next to you.
That makes a terrifying amount of sense.
By using the flat, blunt side of the axe head, the attacker delivers a massive, instantaneously lethal concussion, but the weapon bounces back. He retains total mobility.
Right.
It's gruesome to discuss, obviously, but it indicates a perpetrator who really understood the physical mechanics of his weapon and the biological reality of his victims.
From there, the horror just cascades. He moves to the children's room. Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and little Paul, just 5. He murders all 4 of them as they sleep.
It's just unthinkable.
Having cleared the upstairs, he heads back down those narrow stairs to the guest room and attacks the Stillinger sisters. And the forensic evidence, like the positioning of the bodies, suggests that 12-year-old Lena might have been the only person in the entire house who actually woke up just a fraction of a second before the end.
It brings up a really good point about the acoustics of a 1912 timber frame house. These structures are not soundproof at all.
No, they creak when the wind blows.
Exactly. Yet an intruder navigates the stairs, murders 6 people on the second floor, and the 2 girls directly below hear absolutely nothing until he enters their room. The silence of the execution is staggering.
But the murders themselves, the actual taking of life, seem to be only phase 1 of his process. What he does afterward is where the psychology gets deeply, profoundly bizarre.
The staging.
Yes. He doesn't flee. He goes back upstairs taking his time and systematically strikes the victims again. He hits Joe Moore an estimated 30 times. The faces of the entire family are rendered completely unrecognizable.
Just overkill.
Absolute overkill. And then the staging begins. He pulls the heavy bedclothes up over Joe and Sarah, completely covering their ruined faces. He finds a gauze undershirt and drapes it over Herman's face. He takes a dress and covers Catherine. He does this for every single victim.
Psychologically, reducing a victim's face to pulp often points to an intensely personal rage, like a desire to obliterate the person's identity. But when you couple it with the careful, deliberate shrouding of the bodies afterward, it suggests something a bit more complex. It often points to a profound psychological fear or some kind of detachment mechanism.
Like he's hiding his own work from himself.
Or he's hiding himself from them. In the mind of a severely disturbed individual, the dead might still possess a kind of agency.
Oh, creepy.
They might still be watching him, you know. Covering their faces severs that perceived connection. He is neutralizing their gaze.
And that idea of the gaze perfectly explains his next move, which is the detail that always gets to me. He systematically goes through the house, room by room, and covers every single mirror and reflective piece of glass.
He covers them with whatever he can find.
Yeah, clothes, towels, just draped over them. Why would someone take the time to do that in a house full of dead bodies?
It's a very old, deep-seated superstition found in a lot of cultures. The idea that mirrors are portals, or that the soul of the newly dead can be trapped in a reflection, or even that the mirror can record the face of the killer. So by covering the mirrors, he is expanding on what he did to the victims' faces. He is attempting to completely erase any eyes from the environment.
So it's about being unseen.
Whether it's a manifestation of extreme guilt or a full psychotic break, where he genuinely believes the dead are observing him, he's desperately trying to render himself invisible.
He also pulls skirts and aprons over the windows, completely blacking out the house. But then, as he's preparing to leave, he leaves behind something so strange that it has baffled people for over a century.
The bacon.
Yes. He goes to the icebox in the kitchen, takes out a 2-pound slab of uncooked bacon, wraps it in a towel, and drops it on the floor in the downstairs bedroom next to the murdered Stillinger girls.
It makes no sense.
Right next to the bacon, he leaves a mysterious piece of a keychain that did not belong to anyone in the Moore family. He washes his hands in a bowl of water, locks the doors, takes the keys with him, and disappears into the pre-dawn mist. I mean, you can analyze the lamp and the mirrors all day, but how do you explain a raw slab of bacon?
Well, it is the ultimate anomaly. Investigators have theorized for decades.
Like what?
Some wondered if it was a distraction for a guard dog. But the Moores didn't have a dog inside the house. Could it have been an aborted meal?
Like he got hungry?
Yeah. Did the adrenaline crash, leaving him suddenly ravenous, only for a sudden panic to make him drop it and run? Or is it a psychological signature so personal and distorted that only he understood its meaning?
It's so weird.
The juxtaposition of this highly organized tactical assault with a raw slab of meat and a broken keychain is what cements this crime in the public imagination. It's a terrifying blend of absolute control and just complete absurdity.
And that bizarre, silent crime scene sat there, locked tight, entirely undiscovered as the sun came up. Which brings us to the morning after, and if the night was defined by silent control, the day was defined by chaotic, irreversible destruction.
The discovery phase.
Let's talk about it because it completely doomed any chance of solving this case.
The tragedy of the crime is immediately compounded by the tragedy of the community's response. We really have to look at how a town completely untrained in crisis management reacts to the unthinkable.
It's June 10th, a beautiful summer morning. The neighbor next door, Mary Peckham, is out hanging her laundry. By 7 a.m., she realizes something is wrong.
Because it's too quiet.
Yeah, the Moore house is usually a beehive of activity kids running around, chores being done. But the house is dead silent, the window shades are all drawn. Out in the barn, Joe's horses are restless and neighing because nobody has fed them.
Which is a huge red flag for a farmer.
Huge. So Mary knocks on the door. It's locked. She tries the windows. Locked. So she calls Joe's brother, Ross Moore, who owns a local store. Ross arrives completely confused and uses his own spare key to open the front door.
Think about the psychological weight of that moment for Ross. He is walking into a void. The house is dark, the air is stagnant, and the metallic smell of blood would have been overpowering.
Ross steps into the parlor. He looks through the doorway into the gloom of the downstairs guest bedroom. He sees the blood on the bed sheets. He doesn't go any further.
Smart man.
Yeah, he turns around, bolts out the front door, and starts screaming for Marshal Hank Horton. Marshal Horton goes in, confirms the horror, and slowly the local doctors begin to arrive. One of them is Dr. F.S. Williams.
Poor Dr. Williams.
He walks through the house, examines the 8 bodies, and when he walks out onto the porch, he sees that a massive crowd of townspeople has already gathered on the lawn. Word travels fast. Dr. Williams looks at this crowd, visibly shaken, and he gives them a very stark warning. He says, "Don't go in there, boys. You'll regret it until the last day of your life."
It was incredibly prescient advice. I mean, he understood the psychological trauma that visuals of that magnitude inflict on a person.
Absolutely.
But from an investigative standpoint, keeping that crowd out was the single most important thing that needed to happen.
But the crowd completely ignores him, and this is where my jaw hit the floor reading the Smithsonian piece. Throughout that day, an estimated 100 people, neighbors, businessmen, curious kids, pushed their way into the house.
Unbelievable.
They tramped up and down the stairs, they touched the furniture, they scattered their own fingerprints everywhere, they tracked mud and dirt over whatever footprints the killer might have left.
They ruined everything.
And in a display of morbid curiosity that genuinely makes my stomach turn, some people were actually picking up fragments of Joe Moore's shattered skull from the bedroom floor and putting them in their pockets to take home as keepsakes.
Yeah, souvenirs.
Like, if you're a detective arriving from out of town at 3 p.m., you are walking into a nightmare. Where do you even begin when the whole town has essentially tracked the evidence out on the soles of their boots?
You don't begin. The scene is fundamentally compromised. To understand why this happened, we have to contextualize 1912 forensic science and rural law enforcement.
Okay, set the scene.
Today, if a window breaks, we expect yellow police tape, Tyvek suits, and a clear exclusion zone. In 1912, the concept of crime scene preservation was practically non-existent outside of major metropolitan forces like New York or London.
But fingerprinting existed,
It
right?
existed, yes.
Uh,
The Bertillon system of body measurements was giving way to fingerprinting, but it was highly specialized. A local town marshal like Hank Horton wasn't walking around with fingerprint dusting powder.
right.
Blood typing was barely in its experimental infancy. They couldn't even definitively distinguish human blood from animal blood at a rural crime scene, let alone narrow it down to a suspect.
That's wild.
The only hope they had of catching this person was a clear footprint, a dropped item, or tracking dogs.
Yeah.
And the townspeople destroyed all three. By tramping through the house, they erased the killer's physical narrative and replaced it with 100 of their own.
But why do you think people did that? Taking skull fragments, it seems so completely contrary to normal human behavior.
It's a mechanism for processing incomprehensible trauma. When an event is too massive, too horrific to digest, people often try to take a physical piece of it to prove to themselves that actually happened.
Oh, interesting.
It's a dark, tactile connection to a reality they can't mentally map. But the immediate consequence of that curiosity was a delayed realization of what it all meant. Once they stepped back out into the daylight, the gravity of the situation finally hit them.
And the gravity was. A monster didn't come from the deep, dark woods. The monster opened a simple wooden door exactly like the ones on every other house in Villisca.
Right. The illusion was gone.
The panic that followed was absolute. According to the historical newspaper clippings, by sundown on Juneteenth, you could not buy a physical lock in the town of Villisca. The hardware stores sold out completely. The farmers from the surrounding counties drove in and bought every single dog available for sale. They were desperately trying to rebuild the barrier between themselves and the outside world.
But a lock doesn't fix a broken societal contract. Because they had ruined the physical evidence, the investigation immediately stalled. And when a community is terrified and the authorities have zero answers, a very dangerous psychological shift occurs.
Paranoia.
Yes, desperation mutates into wild speculation.
And the speculation was wild. You had locals acting like amateur sleuths, finding clues everywhere. A woman named Retta Johnson went into the house during the stampede and later claimed she saw indentations on some cotton batting bags in a downstairs closet.
Right, the closet theory.
She loudly concluded that the killer must have been hiding in the closet for hours, just waiting for the family to fall asleep. People were staring at unoccupied beds, analyzing broken chains, doing anything to impose order on the chaos.
Which is human nature. We abhor a vacuum.
Yeah.
If there is no clear narrative, we will invent one. And because there was no physical evidence pointing to a transient stranger, the town began to look inward.
Scapegoating.
Exactly. If a stranger didn't do this, the logic went, then someone we know did.
And that transition from fearing the outside world to fearing your neighbors completely fractured Villisca. It tore the community apart along deeply entrenched social, economic, and religious lines. Let's look at the suspects the town turned on, because the theories tell us more about the town's existing resentments than they do about the crime.
It gets really political.
The first massive target, suspect number one, was Frank Jones. Now, Frank Jones was the absolute opposite of a transient drifter. He was a wealthy state senator, a highly prominent businessman who owned a huge retail store, and a very visible pillar of the local Methodist Church.
He was, for all intents and purposes, local royalty.
Yeah.
He held immense power over the economic lifeblood of the town.
Which is exactly where the friction started. Joe Moore, the murdered father, used to be Frank Jones's star employee. Joe worked for Jones for 7 years, selling farm equipment. He was fantastic at his job. But Joe grew tired of Jones's punishing expectations, working from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. 6 days a week.
That's brutal.
So, Joe quit. He walked down the street and opened up a rival implement business. And to add a massive insult to the injury, Joe somehow managed to take the incredibly lucrative John Deere tractor account away from Frank Jones and bring it to his new store.
In an agricultural hub in 1912, losing the John Deere account isn't just a loss of revenue, it's a massive public humiliation. It challenged Jones's supremacy in the town.
Exactly. But it wasn't just business. The rumor mill in Villisca was incredibly toxic. The prevailing gossip was that Joe Moore had been having an affair with Frank Jones's daughter-in-law, Donna.
A classic small-town scandal.
Now, Donna was a local beauty, and according to the lore, she had a notoriously indiscreet habit of arranging her romantic trysts using the local telephone.
Which is crucial context. In 1912, making a phone call meant picking up an earpiece, cranking a handle, and speaking directly to a human switchboard operator.
Right.
You'd say, "Connect me to this number." The operator physically plugged a wire into a board. And quite frequently, the operator would just leave the channel open and listen in on the conversation. There were no secrets on a small-town switchboard.
So the whole town knew, or thought they knew, about this affair. The bad blood between Joe Moore and Frank Jones became so intense and so public that by early 1912, the two men were literally crossing the dirt streets to avoid walking past each other.
The tension was palpable.
So when Joe and his entire family are massacred, half the town immediately points at the most powerful man they know.
But we have to apply critical thinking here. Frank Jones was 57 years old. He was a wealthy politician. The idea that a man in his late 50s crept into a house in the dead of night and swung a heavy axe 30 times with such ferocity that it pulverized 6 people.
It's ridiculous.
It defies physical and logical reality.
Which is exactly what the town realized. So the narrative evolved. Enter Detective James Wilkerson. Wilkerson was an operative for the Burns Detective Agency, which was like the Pinkertons, a private intelligence and security firm.
A very controversial figure.
Wilkerson arrives in Villisca, takes the temperature of the town, and builds this elaborate, massive crusade against Frank Jones. Wilkerson loudly insists that Jones didn't swing the axe. He hired a hitman from Illinois named William Mansfield to wipe out the Moore family.
Wilkerson is a fascinating and destructive character in this saga. Private detectives of this era operated with very little oversight. They often functioned more like mercenaries or fixers than modern police investigators.
Yeah, he had his own agenda.
Wilkerson provided a narrative that perfectly suited the grievances of a segment of the town. The idea of a corrupt, wealthy mastermind pulling the strings is a much easier, almost cinematic pill to swallow than acknowledging a random, chaotic act of violence by a passing madman. It gives the tragedy a clear, understandable motive.
But the collateral damage of Wilkerson's crusade was catastrophic for the town's social fabric. It became a holy war. The Methodist Frank Jones's congregation rallied behind him, insisting he was a good Christian man being framed by a rogue detective.
And the other side?
The Presbyterians, which was the Moore family's church, threw all their weight behind Wilkerson, fully believing Jones was a monster. You had lifelong neighbors suddenly refusing to speak to each other.
It's the weaponization of grief.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned earlier, if we step back, the hitman theory is extraordinarily weak.
Right. I have to push back on the very premise of it. Are we really supposed to believe that a wealthy, image-obsessed 57-year-old state senator hires an out-of-town assassin to wipe out a family of 8, including 4 young kids and 2 completely random neighbor girls who just happen to be sleeping over a farm equipment rivalry and a family scandal?
It's a stretch.
It feels like the plot of a terrible Penny Dreadful novel. It totally overshadows the reality of the tragedy.
Your skepticism is entirely justified, and history bore it out. When Wilkerson finally managed to drag his supposed hitman, William Mansfield, in front of a grand jury in 1916, the case collapsed instantly.
He had an alibi, right?
A cast-iron alibi. Payroll records unequivocally proved he was hundreds of miles away in Illinois, working at his job at the exact time the murders took place. He was released. But Wilkerson, deeply invested in his own narrative, refused to let it go.
Wilkerson totally spiraled into madness. Reading through the old I.A. Jane Webb archives, the newspaper updates about Wilkerson are insane. In 1917, he is literally arrested in Corning, Iowa for conspiracy to commit a felony.
Wait, really?
Yes. He apparently furnished revolvers and getaway cars to 3 men, instructing them to break into Frank Jones's store and steal his private papers, hoping to find a written contract for the hitman.
That is unhinged.
Then, a year later in 1918, Wilkerson gets arrested again in a hotel in Ottumwa, Iowa. He's registered under fake names alongside a widow named Mrs. Noel, and the kicker. Her late husband had been a photographer who acted as a star witness for Wilkerson, and that photographer had mysteriously turned up dead with a bullet in his head in a rail yard a year prior. It is sheer madness.
It is the definition of a witch hunt. The community needed a villain so desperately that they allowed a rogue, clearly unstable detective to essentially run a shadow justice system based on paranoia and vendettas.
Exactly.
And when the Frank Jones mastermind theory inevitably failed in the courts, the town pivoted entirely. If it wasn't the powerful local oligarch, it had to be the town outcast. Which leads us to the second major suspect, a man who was the absolute antithesis of Frank Jones.
Suspect number 2, The Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly.
A deeply, deeply tragic and troubling figure.
Let's look at Kelly's profile because it's a lot to take in. He is a tiny English immigrant, standing about 5'2" and weighing maybe 119 pounds. He is an itinerant, unordained preacher, traveling around preaching mostly to Presbyterian congregations.
He had a lot of issues.
Yeah, a well-documented history of severe mental health issues coupled with deeply concerning sexual deviancy. Just 2 days before the murders, he was caught peeping into windows in Villisca.
Which is a massive red flag.
Later, in 1914, while living in South Dakota, he placed an advertisement in the Omaha World Herald asking for a girl stenographer to do confidential work, adding that she must be willing to pose as model.
And the follow-up to that ad is chilling.
Yeah. A woman replied to the ad, and Kellett sent back a letter that was so intensely graphic and disturbing that when he was arrested for sending obscene material through the mail, the judge flat out refused to read the letter into the public court record. Kelly was demanding she type for him in the nude.
So we have a man ruled by compulsion, severe delusions, and sexual deviancy. That alone makes him a person of interest. But what made him the prime suspect was his proximity to the victims.
Crucially, Kelly was in Villisca on the day and night of the murders. In fact, he attended the exact same Children's Day church service where the Moore children and the Stillinger girls had performed just hours before they were all killed.
He was watching them.
And his behavior immediately following the crime was incredibly suspicious. He leaves town on an early train at 5:19 a.m. on June 10th, hours before Mary Peckham even noticed the silent house. While on that train, he starts telling fellow passengers that 8 people have been murdered in Villisca. He knew before anyone else knew.
Furthermore, he was left-handed. The coroner, by analyzing the cast-off blood spatter on the low ceiling of the Moore house, had deduced that the killer almost certainly swung the axe left-handed.
Right.
Kelly also sent a bundle of bloody shirts to a local laundry shortly after the murders. The circumstantial web closing around him was incredibly dense.
And then, the nail in the coffin, he confessed. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, after hours of intense police interrogation, Reverend Kelly signs a formal confession.
But look at the context.
He claims he was lying out in the fields outside Villisca, listening to voices in his head. He said a voice commanded him to slay utterly. According to his confession, he picked up the axe, went into the house, and killed the children upstairs first and the children downstairs last.
But if we examine the reality of false confessions, especially in an era preceding Miranda rights, a time when police interrogations often equated to psychological and sometimes physical torture, Kelly's confession begins to disintegrate.
So you think he was fed the details?
It is highly probable. We are looking at a fragile, profoundly mentally ill man who was grilled relentlessly by state agents desperate to close the most infamous cold case in Iowa history. He later recanted the confession entirely, claiming it was beaten out of him.
Wow.
And the judicial system, despite the massive public pressure to hang him, ultimately couldn't make it stick. The first grand jury hung 11-1 against indicting him. When they finally did bring him to trial, a jury acquitted him.
Even his wife stepped in, right?
Yes, his own wife testified on his behalf, noting that he had a history of confessing to crimes he couldn't possibly have committed. She proved he was sitting at home with her during another crime he had eagerly confessed to in the past. His mind was just broken. He was a man who confessed because of his delusions, and the state tried to use him as a convenient trash can to throw the case into.
So let's step back and look at the board. The wealthy state senator pulling strings was a bust. The tiny, delusional preacher with the false confession was acquitted. If it wasn't a local grudge, and it wasn't the town outcast, who the hell was it?
This is where it gets really dark.
Here is where our deep dive pivots away from the claustrophobia of small-town politics and takes a truly terrifying turn. We have to look at the theory that Villisca was just one bloody stop on a nationwide tour of terror. We are entering the realm of the transient serial killer.
This is a paradigm-shifting theory, championed heavily by a Department of Justice special agent named Matthew McClary. He was looking at crime data decades before the FBI officially established its behavioral science unit.
He was ahead of his time.
He really was. McClary noticed a pattern that local sheriffs, isolated by geography and relying on telegraphs or the mail, had completely missed.
The pattern is genuinely chilling. McClary tracked a string of nearly 10 axe murders that occurred between 1911 and 1912, scattered across the Midwestern and Western United States. We are talking about massacres in Colorado Springs, Colorado, Monmouth, Illinois, Paola, Kansas, Ellsworth, Kansas, and even Rainier, Washington.
And they all connected.
McClary saw striking, undeniable behavioral signatures connecting all of these crimes directly to Villisca.
What's fascinating here is the concept of a behavioral signature versus a modus operandi.
What's the difference?
Well, an MO is what a killer needs to do to accomplish the crime. Bringing a weapon, breaking a lock. A signature is something the killer has to do to fulfill a psychological need. It's totally unnecessary to the actual killing. These crimes shared incredibly specific signatures.
Right, let's list them. The attacks almost exclusively took place on Sunday nights. The murder weapon was almost always an axe, and crucially, it was never the killer's axe.
He found it on site.
Found it on the property and consistently abandoned it at the scene right out in the open. The attacks were always near railway tracks. The killer washed his hands in a bowl at the scene. He covered the faces of the sleeping victims post-mortem. And most damningly, he used the exact same chimneyless lamp trick to create a low-light environment.
That lamp modification is the linchpin. Bending a wick and removing a chimney is not a standard burglary technique passed around in prisons. It is a highly specific, idiosyncratic behavioral quirk. To see it replicated across multiple states in identical axe murders strongly points to a single perpetrator.
And the connective tissue between all these towns is the railroad. It's like an early 20th century horror movie monster. He is this phantom who rides the rails, steps off a boxcar into a sleepy town in the dead of night, performs this incredibly specific ritualistic nightmare, and then just dissolves back into the steam of the locomotive.
Exactly.
By the time Mary Peckham realizes the house is too quiet, this guy is 3 states away eating breakfast in a diner.
You've hit on the exact mechanism that made this possible. The rapidly expanding American railroad system created an entirely new vector for crime. It was essentially the dark web of physical travel in 1912.
That's a great way to put it.
It provided unparalleled anonymity and extreme mobility. Before the transcontinental rail networks, criminals were tethered to the endurance of a horse. The range was maybe a few counties, and a stranger riding into town was immediately scrutinized. The train changed everything. Hundreds of transient workers, hobos, and travelers were moving through these rail yards every day. A killer could blend into the industrial churn seamlessly.
The timeline of these events is what really sells the theory for me. The murders in Paola, Kansas, where Roland Hudson and his wife were killed, happened just 5 days before Villisca. 5 days.
Absolutely.
And there is a detail in the Smithsonian article that completely gave me goosebumps. On the exact night of the Paola murders, another family living in the same town woke up in the dead of night because they heard the distinct sound of a glass lamp chimney hitting the wooden floor. They woke up just in time to see a man scrambling out of their window and escaping. Was that our killer practicing his chimneyless lamp trick, failing, and then moving on to his actual victims across town?
It strongly suggests a rehearsal, or an aborted attack where his light discipline failed. He dropped the glass, lost the element of surprise, and aborted. It shows he was actively refining his methodology as he traveled.
But the detail that absolutely haunts me, the one I cannot stop thinking about, comes from the Ellsworth, Kansas murders in October 1911, about 8 months before Villisca.
The Showman family.
Yes, William Showman, his wife, and their 3 kids are slaughtered with an axe. The killer uses the chimneyless lamp, he covers their faces, but he also does something completely unique to that house. He finds a pile of clothing, and he meticulously drapes it over the Showman's wall-mounted telephone, completely covering it. Why take the time to cover a telephone in 1911 at 1 in the morning? It's not going to ring. It's not going to wake anyone up.
Think back to our discussion about the mirrors in the Moore house. What did an early 20th century wall phone look like? Think of the classic Western Electric Model 317. It's a large wooden box on the wall, and right on the front are 2 prominent round metal bells.
They look exactly like eyes.
Precisely. To a severely psychotic mind, a mind terrified of being observed by the dead or by unseen forces, those bells represent a gaze, covering the eyes of the telephones driven by the exact same psychological imperative as covering a mirror. He needed total, absolute visual isolation to perform his rituals.
That is deeply unsettling. It paints a picture of a man completely detached from humanity, operating under a terrifying set of internal rules.
And who never caught him.
No. Because this transient killer was never definitively caught, Agent McClary strongly suspected a convicted killer named Henry Lee Moore, who eventually went to prison for killing his own mother and grandmother, but the link is hotly debated. The Villisca mystery remained a massive open wound, and an open wound in the public consciousness leads to a desperate, clawing psychological need for closure.
Which brings us to the ghosts.
Right. An entire century of ghosts, absurd theories, and more false confessions.
When a crime of this magnitude, this level of pure violation, goes permanently unsolved, the human brain simply rejects the lack of resolution. We cannot tolerate a void.
So we make things up.
If the authorities, the people meant to protect us, cannot provide an answer, the public will manufacture one.
And oh boy, did they manufacture them. Reading through these old newspaper clippings from the I.A. Jane Webb archives is like reading a catalog of mass delusion and hysteria. Let's start with the retina theory because it blew my mind.
Oh, the optography stuff.
Yes. In August 1912, just 2 months after the murders, a newspaper in Council Bluffs genuinely reported as fact that detectives had obtained a photograph of the killer. How? By magically extracting the final image that was trapped on the dead retina of 12-year-old Lena Stillinger's eye.
It sounds utterly absurd to a modern ear, almost like science fiction. But we have to place ourselves in the cultural mindset of the early 1900s.
Right, science was moving fast.
Exactly. This was a period where breakthrough science like X-rays and wireless telegraphy felt like magic, and it frequently overlapped with spiritualism in the public imagination. The concept you're referring to is called optography. The belief that the eye functions literally like a camera, capturing and developing the last image it sees upon death.
Like taking a snapshot of the murderer.
Exactly. It was a wildly popular myth, fueled by sensationalist journalism. The fact that the public, and even some law enforcement, believed this could crack the Villisca case shows just how desperate they were. They were praying for a magical solution to an impossible problem.
And when the magic eye camera didn't produce a suspect, they just resorted to arresting literally anyone who looked suspicious or acted strangely. They arrested Sam Moyer, Joe Moore's brother-in-law, simply because he'd had a few arguments with Joe in the past.
Such flimsy evidence.
They arrested a random farmhand named John Bolin all the way down in Missouri because Bolin started rambling about a vision where God told someone to kill people who didn't bear the mark of the Lord. They even arrested a black man named Frank Roberts in Sioux City just because he happened to be traveling through the area at the time, which reeks of the casual, reflexive racial prejudice of the era.
This is the immense danger of a panicked community. The burden of proof evaporates. Anyone perceived as an outsider, anyone exhibiting abnormal behavior, or anyone of a marginalized demographic becomes an immediate target for the mob's anxiety.
And the confessions, they kept coming for decades. In 1913, a dying man in Montana who used to be a blacksmith in Villisca summons a minister and makes a dramatic deathbed confession, claiming he committed the murders. But when detectives actually investigate his timeline, he had no real connection to the event.
People just want the infamy.
Then, incredibly, 18 years later in 1931, a career burglar named George Myers is sitting in a Detroit jail cell. He calls detectives over and confesses that a wealthy businessman paid him $2,000 to wipe out the family.
Which sounds incredibly familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It sounds suspiciously like Detective Wilkerson's old hitman theory, recycled and digested through the underworld rumor mill for 2 decades.
Exactly. Because the moment the police pressed Myers for actual details of the crime scene, he completely ruined his own credibility. He claimed he killed 6 people. He didn't even know the 2 Stillinger girls were in the house.
Right.
So why do we do this? Why does the public continually buy into these fake leads? And why do people keep confessing? Is it just that the human brain cannot accept that someone can swing an axe 30 times and walk away completely unpunished?
Yes, that is the core of it. Acknowledging that someone can walk into a secure home, butcher 8 innocent people, and vanish into the night without facing justice is an acknowledgement of our own profound, inescapable vulnerability.
It's terrifying.
It means the monster is real, and the monster got away. False confessions, even the most obvious, ridiculous ones, provide a narrative structure. They offer us a villain with a face, a villain we can put in handcuffs and lock in a cage. Without a captured villain, the fear remains ambient, formless, and omnipresent.
It's a heavy realization. But while the murders forever defined Villisca in the national press, cementing it as a town of tragedy, the actual town itself didn't just freeze in time in 1912. The physical structures left behind tell a much broader, much more complex story. We've talked about the anatomy of the crime, the panic, the transient serial killer theories, but now I want to shift our focus to the physical legacy of the town.
The buildings.
Specifically, an incredible building that was rising from the dirt at the exact moment the community was tearing itself apart, the Villisca National Guard Armory.
The contrast between the Morehouse and the Armory provides the perfect metaphor for how a community processes trauma. One structure is the site of ultimate passive victimization. The other is a monument to resilience, active duty, and communal strength.
Let's dig into this academic architectural preservation paper by Abby Williams, which is an absolutely incredible source. The Villisca Armory was designed in 1912 and finished in 1913. Literally while the blood was still drying, while the hardware stores were selling out of locks, and while Senator Jones and Detective Wilkerson were starting their holy war, the town was coming together to excavate a massive basement right on the town square.
It's a huge undertaking.
Today, it stands as the oldest armory still owned by the Guard in Iowa, and it holds the longest continuous military use in the entire state.
And its architectural design speaks volumes about its psychological purpose. It was built as a fortress of stability.
Let's paint a picture of it because it's striking. It's this fascinating mix of late Victorian Romanesque revival meets Tudor revival. It's a massive two-story masonry building, 61 feet wide by 122 feet deep. The front facade is made of what the paper calls 6.1 American Bond polychrome vitrified face brick.
Which is a mouthful.
Right. Now, for those of us who aren't architects, polychrome vitrified brick basically means these bricks were fired in a kiln at such incredibly high temperatures that the clay almost becomes glass-like. It makes them super hard, weather-resistant, and slightly shiny. They use tinted red mortar between the bricks. It has these sweeping, corbelled brick archways over the entrance, and originally, it had castellations along the roofline, those square, teeth-like structures you see on medieval castle walls. They literally built a castle in the middle of Iowa.
It was explicitly designed to project strength and impenetrable security during a time when the citizens of the town felt utterly, terrifyingly defenseless. But we shouldn't view it strictly as a military bunker. It was the beating heart of the community's social and civic life.
It really was. And the historical irony here is just palpable. In 1917, a massive, highly contentious public town hall meeting about the Axe murders was held right in the Armory Gymnasium. That was the specific meeting where Detective Wilkerson and Senator Frank Jones openly clashed in front of everybody. So you have the town literally tearing itself apart over murder conspiracies inside the walls of this newly built fortress.
It's a fascinating dynamic. The very building that housed their bitter internal divisions would soon become the staging ground for their unified external defense.
Exactly. Because the military history of this building is staggering. It housed Company F of the 55th Infantry. It saw intense local dramas during the Spanish-American War, where a commanding officer, Captain Burton, was actually accused of cowardice and running a loan sharking operation, charging his own enlisted men 50% interest on loans.
Yeah, the drama.
But the Armory's true, defining historical moment came decades later during World War II.
The incredible story of Captain Bob Moore.
Yes. Bob Moore was the local drugstore owner in Villisca. But when the war broke out, he led the men of Company Esch out of the armory doors, down to the train station, and eventually all the way to the deserts of North Africa. They fought in the brutal, chaotic battle of Kasserine Pass against Rommel's forces, where many Villisca boys were tragically killed or captured.
It was a horrific battle.
But Major Moore managed to lead 420 men who were completely cut off from Allied forces through enemy lines to safety. When he finally came home on leave in 1943, an Omaha World Herald photographer named Earl Bunker happened to be at the Villisca train station and snapped a photo of Moore embracing his family on the platform. That single photograph won the Pulitzer Prize.
That image is the emotional antithesis of the Axe murders. Think about it. The murders took a family away in the dark, destroying a home. The Pulitzer photo captures a family reunited in the light, representing the survival of the town, and the armory was the anchor for all of it.
It was the center of everything.
Between wars, it hosted the annual military balls, the firemen's ball, high school basketball games, community dances. It was the space where life continued.
And today, there is a fierce, ongoing fight to preserve that life. The architectural paper details the modern preservation efforts led by a local woman named Roxana Cyber. They are working tirelessly to save the building, turning it into a community center and a military history museum. And preserving a historic building is not easy work.
Oh, it's a nightmare sometimes.
They have to adhere to strict guidelines called preservation briefs, which are essentially rule books issued by the National Park Service on how to restore historic properties without ruining their character.
It is a grueling, meticulous process.
They had to figure out how to repoint that historic red-tinted mortar without damaging the vitrified wick. They had to rip out ugly 1950s aluminum windows and replace them with historically accurate, custom-made wooden double-hung windows. They had to fix this massive flat and pitched roof that had been leaking for years and destroying the original beautiful pressed tin ceiling in the gymnasium. They even had to navigate the architectural puzzle of adding modern ADA-compliant wheelchair ramps to the front entrance without destroying the aesthetics of that grand Romanesque entry arch.
Preservation is an act of profound respect. By choosing to pour money, sweat, and years of effort into saving the armory, the people of Villisca are making a deliberate choice. They're choosing to define their town's legacy by its service, its community gatherings, and its survival, rather than allowing themselves to be exclusively defined by their darkest tragedy.
Which provides the starkest possible contrast to our final topic today. We have to return to the site where it all began. We have to explore what has become of the Moore House. Because while the armory represents noble preservation and community pride, the Moore House represents the highly controversial, often deeply unsettling world of dark tourism.
The life cycle of a murder house is always fraught with profound ethical dilemmas. How do we, as a society, treat a space where the unspeakable actually happened?
Well, for decades, the town of Villisca treated it like an unwanted, cursed burden. The Moore House changed hands an astonishing 13 times over 90 years. It was owned by a savings and loan at one point. It sat completely vacant for long stretches.
Nobody wanted it.
In the 1960s and 70s, it was used as a rental property, but the turnover rate was insanely high. Tenants would move in, unpack, and then suddenly leave weeks later. There is even a piece of local lore from the 1960s, and who knows how much is fact versus legend, where a renter was supposedly making dinner in the kitchen, saw a strange flash of light, went into a total daze, and woke up to find a knife stuck through his own hand. He reportedly packed his family into their car and fled the property immediately.
Whether you place any stock in the paranormal or whether you simply acknowledge the immense, crushing psychological weight of trying to eat dinner and raise children in a space saturated with such horrific history, it's clear the house was fundamentally uninhabitable as a normal home. The ambient stress of knowing what happened in those rooms would be overwhelming for anyone.
So it sat there until 1994, when local historians Darwin and Martha Lynn decided to buy it. And from a purely architectural standpoint, what the Lynns did was a masterclass in historical restoration.
They really did an amazing job.
They didn't just paint it, they went backward in time. They used old, grainy photographs and conducted interviews with elderly neighbors to piece together exactly what the house looked like on the day of the murders in 1912. They stripped away decades of vinyl siding. They tore down modern patio enclosures. They painstakingly removed the modern electricity and indoor plumbing. They literally ripped out an indoor bathroom to convert it back into the pantry it was in 1912. In 1997, because of their meticulous work, it was officially added to the National Register of Historic Places.
From a strictly historical perspective, preserving a middle-class 1868 Queen Anne timber house as a perfect time capsule is commendable. Most homes of that era are bulldozed or renovated beyond recognition. It provides a rare tactile link to the past.
But it's not just an architectural time capsule, is it? It's a crime scene. The Lynns opened it up to the public, not just for daytime educational historical tours, but for overnight stays.
That's where it gets complicated.
For a fee, you can sleep there. And predictably, it has become a mecca for ghost hunters, YouTube paranormal channels, and morbid thrill seekers. And in 2014, the house nearly claimed another life. An amateur paranormal investigator from Wisconsin was paying to stay there overnight. He was alone in the downstairs bedroom, the exact room where the Stillinger sisters were murdered.
Oh, no.
According to the police reports, he was actively trying to provoke spirits. And around midnight, he somehow ended up stabbing himself in the chest. He had to be airlifted to a hospital in Omaha in serious condition. He survived, but claimed later he had absolutely no memory of doing it.
This incident crystallizes the crux of the dark tourism debate. Why are we, as a culture, drawn to literally sleep in the beds where children were massacred? It speaks to a societal morbid curiosity that frankly hasn't evolved very much since the townspeople tramped through the blood to steal skull fragments in 1912.
That's a great point.
The technology has changed, but the impulse is identical.
Whoa.
We are still gawking at the scene.
It really makes you ask, is restoring a murder house to its exact 1912 condition an act of honoring history? Or are we just meticulously preserving a nightmare? At what point does honoring the past cross the line into commodifying a tragedy for entertainment?
It's a line that is incredibly difficult, perhaps impossible to definitively draw. The restoration freezes the house entirely at the moment of its greatest trauma. It ensures that Joe, Sarah, their 4 children, and the 2 Stillinger girls are forever defined by their final terrifying moments in the dark. Their lives before that night are erased.
Yeah.
Yet simultaneously tearing the house down and paving over the lot is an attempt to sanitize history, to erase a harsh reality just because it makes us uncomfortable. There is no clean, easy answer.
It's just such a surreal juxtaposition to think about. Picture it. You have this meticulously restored 1868 timber house sitting quietly on a residential street. It is a beautiful, important piece of architectural history. But inside, instead of a family eating dinner, it's filled with tourists holding EMF meters, night vision cameras, and audio recorders in the pitch black, sitting in silence, hoping to catch the echo of a swinging axe.
It forces us to confront our own relationship with history, violence, and empathy. Do we visit these places to learn from them, to understand our own vulnerabilities, or do we seek to be entertained by the echoes of someone else's suffering?
Okay, let's bring this all together. What a heavy, fascinating journey this deep dive has been. We have traveled from a brutally silent, methodically staged crime scene in the dead of a June night in 1912. We walked through the contaminated, chaotic aftermath that destroyed the evidence and watched a small town tear itself apart with paranoia, destroying the lives of a prominent local politician and an unhinged preacher alike.
We explored the terrifying reality of the early 20th century, that the expanding railroad networks may have allowed an invisible transient serial killer to ride the rails through the Midwest, executing a grim, ritualistic pattern of chimneyless lamps and covered faces before dissolving back into the steam.
And finally, we looked at how Villisca's soul is fundamentally captured in its remaining brick and timber. You have the haunting, meticulously preserved Moore house on one side, permanently frozen in its worst nightmare, catering to our darkest curiosities. And on the other side of town, you have the proud, enduring armory, a massive brick monument to a community that survived, sent its sons to war, and fought to preserve its own dignity.
It is a powerful reminder that the built environment around us is never just passive scenery.
Exactly. Every single town has its ghosts, and every town has its monuments. The old buildings you drive past every single day, the ones you don't even look twice at on your commute, are holding a century of secrets. They hold scandals, unimaginable tragedies, and moments of quiet heroism.
History is not just written in books. It is literally built into the walls around us.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. Think back to the killer in that house in 1912. He went to incredible, obsessive lengths to avoid being seen. He removed the lamp chimney, bent the wick, and worked in near total darkness. He draped clothing over the mirrors and painstakingly shrouded the faces of his victims because he was so deeply psychologically terrified that the dead or anyone else might be watching him. But think about what his actions actually achieved.
Incredibly ironic legacy.
Did his terrifying, ritualistic attempts to remain invisible actually backfire on a cosmic scale? By leaving behind such a bizarre, theatrical, and unsolvable crime scene, by creating a mystery so dark and so strange that it demanded attention, he ensured the exact opposite of what he wanted. Because of what he did, a century later, millions of people, true crime tourists and amateur sleuths, are doing exactly what he feared most. They are walking into that house, they are staring at him, they are dissecting his every move, his every footstep. He tried desperately to hide in the dark, but in doing so, he guaranteed that the eyes of the world would be watching him forever.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration. Stay curious and always keep questioning the history that surrounds you.
Until next time, thanks for taking the depth dive.